This is northern Maine in January. The year is 1903. Temperature -40 degrees Fahrenheit. That number doesn't mean much until you understand what it does to a human body. At -40, breathing hurts, not discomfort, actual pain. Every breath pulls supercooled air into your lungs, and your body responds by tightening, contracting, bracing for damage. Old loggers described it as swallowing broken glass. Others said it was like breathing smoke that doesn't burn, just shreds. At -40, exposed skin doesn't get cold. It dies. Within minutes, the blood retreats from the surface. The skin turns white, then gray, then hard. Frostbite at these temperatures is not a slow process. It happens fast, without warning, and the worst part is that once the nerve endings freeze, you stop feeling it. The danger becomes invisible. At -40, metals become brittle. Steel that would bend under pressure at room temperature will shatter instead, snap clean like glass. Cast iron, which these logging machines were built from, cracks unpredictably. An axle, a coupling, a boiler fitting. One crack in the wrong place, and a 20-ton machine becomes a 20-ton obstacle in the middle of a frozen forest, miles from the nearest town. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. At -40, the human body begins making very bad decisions. The cold doesn't just attack fingers and toes, it slows the mind. Judgment softens, reaction time fades. A man who has worked 6 hours in this cold loses his edge without realizing it. He makes small mistakes, he misses small signals, and in this job, small mistakes ended careers, missed signals ended lives. This is where our story begins. A man is sitting at the very front of a 20-ton iron machine, open seat, no shelter, no windshield, no heat, nothing between him and a Maine winter except whatever clothes he had thought to put on that morning. Directly above his head, a chimney, the exhaust stack of a working steam boiler. And from that chimney, constantly, in a continuous shower that never stops, red-hot sparks rain down on him. Not occasionally, constantly. Little pieces of fire falling through the frozen dark, landing on his coat, his hat, the back of his neck, his gloves. Some of them catch. He doesn't stop. He can't stop, because in his hands is a steering wheel. And to turn this machine even slightly, even a few degrees left or right, he must spin that wheel 42 full rotations. 42, in the cold, in the dark, with burning sparks falling on his hands. Behind him, chained together like freight cars, are 24 massive sleds, each loaded with freshly cut timber. Total weight 1,500 tons, on a road made entirely of ice. And now, the hill begins. The road drops away. The ice, perfectly smooth, perfectly merciless, offers no resistance. The sleds begin to accelerate. Gravity is pulling 1,500 tons downhill, and nothing is pushing back. This machine has no brakes, not a single one. This is not a weapons test, not a military exercise. This is a logging road carved through the forgotten forests of northern Maine. And the machine rolling down it, this brutal, fire-breathing, bone-crushing iron sled, is doing what it does every night, all winter long. But here is the thing that makes this story bigger than a logging road, bigger than a Maine winter, bigger than timber. From this machine came the tank. From this machine came the bulldozer. From this machine came the snowmobile. From this machine came one of the largest companies on earth. And this machine, over and over, winter after winter, killed the men who ran it. Its name was the Lombard Steam Log Hauler, and its story is the story of how one ordinary man, a blacksmith with no college education and no corporate backing, accidentally changed the history of warfare, construction, and transportation, and was almost completely forgotten for doing it. To understand why Lombard mattered, you need to understand America in the 1890s. The country was growing at a speed that is almost impossible to comprehend today. Between 1880 and 1900, the population of the United States grew from 50 million to 76 million. Cities that had been modest towns in 1880 were exploding into industrial centers: Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, each one consuming resources at a scale that had never existed before in human history. Every one of these cities, every factory, every tenement house, every railroad
It produces less
platform,
horsepower
every
than a
bridge
modern family
needed
car,
one thing
and within
above
15
almost
years
everything
this
else:
truck will be crawling
wood,
onto
wood for
battlefields under
floors,
fire,
wood for
dragging
walls,
broken tanks back
wood
from
for
the dead,
roofs,
and keeping
wood for
entire armored
furniture,
divisions
wood
fighting
for
across North
railroad
Africa,
ties,
Italy, and
and the
Northwest Europe.
railroads were
At a single
expanding at
battle,
10,000
Maine,
miles of new
vehicles
track
like
per
this
year
one will
during
recover
the
over 1,000
1880s.
tanks.
Wood for
The enemy
mine
will covet
shafts,
every example
wood
they
for
capture,
factory
and the
scaffolding,
last one will not
wood for
retire from the British
wagons,
Army until the
wood for ships.
1980s,
America
roughly
in the
60 years after that
1890s
first
ran on
prototype
wood
left the
the
factory
way the
floor.
world in the
This is the Scammell
1970s ran on
Pioneer,
oil.
the
And
civilian
the heart
truck
of
that won a
wood,
world war.
the
To
single
put that in
most important
perspective,
source of
consider what
structural
military
timber
vehicles
in the
looked like in
northeastern United
1927.
States
The
was
Sherman's
Maine.
Glacis offered roughly
Vast,
94
dense,
millimeters effective.
seemingly endless
Hull
spans
sides were
of
3
white
inches
pine
thick,
and spruce
double the Sherman's
stretching
inch and a
across the
half.
upper third
The
of
turret
the
front
state.
was 4 inches,
Forests
with
so
the gun
thick
mantlet
that
varying from
experienced
4.5
woodsmen
to
described
5.5
walking through
inches
them at
in a
midday
complex
and
curved
barely seeing
casting,
the sky.
where the mantlet
But there
overlapped
was
with
a
the turret.
fundamental,
Combined thickness
inescapable
exceeded
problem,
8
a
inches.
problem so
The tank
basic
carried
that
70
everyone
rounds
in
of
the
90
industry had
millimeter
accepted
ammunition
it
in
as a
4
permanent
types.
fact of
The
life.
M77
The
was the
trees were in
basic
the
armor-piercing
hills.
tracer.
The
The
mills were by
M82
the
was a
rivers.
capped round with
Between
explosive
them,
filler,
miles and
effective against
miles of
sloped armor.
frozen
The
wilderness.
T-33
Getting
was a
timber from
high-velocity
where it
round
was
capable
cut
of
to where
defeating
it
the
could be
Panther's
processed
Glacis
was
at up
the
to
central
1,100 yards
logistical
according to
challenge of the
penetration
entire
tables.
industry.
Tank number 40 became
And
the
in the
highest-scoring
1890s, there was only
T-26E3
one
of
way
the
to
war
do
with
it:
4 confirmed
horses
kills.
and
The Cologne
oxen.
Cathedral
A
engagement
good
on
team
March
of
6th
draft horses
demonstrated
could
what
pull
the
a
new
loaded
tank could do
sled
against
through
the
packed
Panther,
snow on
the vehicle
level
most
ground.
Sherman crews
On a
feared.
good
The
day,
Panther's
on
long
a good
75
road,
millimeter
a team
gun,
might
with its
manage a few
935
tons, but the
meters per second
forests of
muzzle
Maine are
velocity
not flat.
actually
The
outpenetrated the
terrain is
90
rugged,
millimeter at close
glacially
range. But the
carved, full of hills
T-26E3's
and
armor could
ravines.
resist the Panther's
And on
gun
a
at
slope,
ranges where the Sherman could
especially
not
a
survive.
downhill
When
slope
Smoyer's
covered in
rounds
ice,
punched
the
through that Panther at
mathematics of
110
horse-drawn
meters,
transport
they proved the
became
American
terrifying.
tank could kill anything, with total
1,500
production
tons
reached
of timber at the top of an icy
2,202
hill,
between November
a team of
1944
horses at the
and
front,
October
and gravity.
1945.
The horses
Fisher Tank
couldn't hold
Arsenal
it.
was the primary
On steep
manufacturer,
grades,
producing
loaded
approximately
sleds overran the
1,190
animals
units.
in front
Detroit
of them.
Tank Arsenal joined
Animals
in
were
March and
crushed.
contributed
Animals fell
246.
and couldn't rise.
Unit
On
cost was
particularly bad runs, entire teams were
$83,273
destroyed,
in
and the men died
1945.
too.
Roughly
Logging was the
1.4
most
million in
dangerous
today's
profession
money.
in America
12
at
were
the
shipped
turn
to
of
the
the
Pacific
century.
for the planned
Not one
invasion
of
of
the most
Japan,
dangerous, the
arriving
most
at Okinawa
dangerous.
on
A
August
single
4th after
log,
fighting there
weighing
had
over
ended.
a ton,
Japan surrendered
rolling
11 days
downhill,
later.
could
Files,
crush a man
rear-mounted
before he had time
transmissions
to
and room for
scream.
bigger guns.
Frostbite
Brigadier General
turned fingers
Gladian
black.
Barnes, Chief of the
Broken
Research
bones
and Development
healed
Branch,
crooked in the
and
field.
engineer Joseph
Men
Colby led
froze
the
to
effort.
death in
Their
their
goal
sleep,
was a
but they
vehicle
kept
that could
coming.
match or exceed
Every
anything
autumn,
the Germans
when
were
the
fielding.
harvest was
The first
in
prototype,
and the
the
farms went
T-20,
quiet, the
used an
men came
automatic
north.
transmission that leaked
Farmers
oil and
their
overheated.
sons,
It was
recent
completed in May
immigrants, men who
1943,
had
but
no
dropped
other
from
winter
consideration
income,
due to mechanical
men
failures.
supporting
The
families,
T-22 used a
men who
conventional
had no
mechanical
choice.
drive.
The
The
logging
T-23
companies knew
adopted
this.
an electric
They knew
transmission
labor
derived
was
from the
cheap and
M6 heavy
replaceable.
tank.
For every
250
man who quit or
T-23s were built
died,
even after
2 more
Devers
were
created
waiting
formal
for his
battle need
job.
by
What
requesting the
wasn't replaceable
T-26E1
was
in
the
November.
season.
Resistance
only
continued
operate
across
in
multiple
winter.
commands.
The ground
It
had
took
to be
George
frozen
Marshall's
hard
personal
to support
intervention on
loaded
December
sleds.
16,
In
1943,
spring, when the ground
overruling the
thawed,
objections
the roads
to
turned
authorize
mud
production
and
of
everything
250
stopped.
T-26E1s.
Not a minor inconvenience.
Even then,
a
Army
hard
ground
stop.
forces kept fighting.
Nothing moved.
The heart
The
of the
entire
Pershing's
year's
firepower
profitability
was the
depended on
90mm
how
Gun
much timber
3,
you could
a
extract
50
during
caliber
the
length
frozen
weapon
months.
derived from the
This was the
90mm
world in
M1
which Alvin
anti-aircraft gun.
Lombard was
It
thinking.
fired a 24-pound
Alvin
armor-piercing
Orlando
projectile at
Lombard was born in
2,670 feet per
1856 in
second,
Springfield,
according to
Maine,
terminal
a
ballistics
small town
data.
in Washington
This produced
County.
an 81%
His father
increase
ran a
in muzzle
local
energy
sawmill.
over the
By the age of
76mm
8,
M1
Alvin
used in
was
late
working
model
in it.
Shermans.
Not just
With
working,
standard M82
watching,
ammunition could not
studying,
reliably
asking
penetrate the
why.
Panther's well-sloped
Most people who
90mm
work with
glasses,
machinery learn
requiring
what the
tungsten
levers
rounds
do.
or flank shots.
Alvin
The Panther's
Lombard
gun
learned
could
why they
penetrate the
did it.
Pershing's
He
glacis at
wanted to
approximately
understand the
600
forces
meters. The
involved.
Pershing's
The
decisive
transmission
advantage
of
was side
power,
protection,
the relationship
3
between
inches
a
versus
spinning
the Panther's
shaft and a
1.5
saw
to
blade,
2 inches
the
in
wood
the
being
close-range
cut.
engagements
He
typical
had
of
the kind
1945
mind
urban
that
combat.
couldn't rest
That
until it
difference saved
understood the
crews.
underlying
Against the
logic
King
of a
Tiger,
system.
the Pershing was
There is a
outclassed.
story
The
about
Tiger II's
Alvin as a
6-inch
boy,
glacis at 50
10 or
degrees
11 years
produced
old,
over 9
that has been
inches of
passed
effective
down by
protection,
local historians.
far outdrew Panther onto
He
the
built
front.
a small
The Super
model wood
Pershing
splitter
reportedly
powered by
engaged
a
a German
water
heavy
wheel.
tank at
A
Dessau in
working
April.
model,
Though
not
whether
a
the
toy.
target was actually a
He
King
tested
Tiger
it by
remains
slicing
disputed
cucumbers
among
in his mother's
historians.
kitchen.
Only
The
one was
machine
built,
worked.
and it saw
His
limited
mother was
action before the
reportedly
war
not
ended.
entirely
Of the 20
pleased about
Zebra
the
mission
cucumbers.
tanks,
That
only one
story
was a
captures
total loss
something
during the war.
essential about who
Tank
Alvin
number
Lombard
25 was destroyed by a
Playful,
Nassau tank
yes.
destroyer's
Curious,
88mm at
absolutely.
Neal on March
But
6th.
above all,
3 others
practical.
suffered serious but
He
repairable
wasn't
damage.
interested in
By
ideas
VE
for
Day
their
on
own
May 8th,
sake. He was
310
interested in
vehicles were in
things that
Europe,
worked.
with approximately
Problems that had
200 issued to
solutions.
frontline combat
He moved to
units.
Waterville,
Hull of a
a
Crusader
larger
cruiser
town
tank,
on the
the
Kennebec
same
River,
low profile.
and
Something
opened a
vital has been
blacksmith
removed
shop
and
with
nobody
his
has gotten
brother
around to
Samuel.
replacing it. The
They
soldiers
built
standing
sawmill
nearby say
equipment
nothing
and
flattering
logging
about it.
tools.
It is not a
Every
tank.
day, men
It is
came
not
in
quite
with
a truck.
stories.
It is a
A
vehicle
broken
designed to
coupling,
drag Britain's
a team
heaviest
that had
anti-tank
failed
gun
on a
across the worst
hillside,
terrain in
a
Western Europe,
season
and it
lost
carries
to
no
weather
weapon
and
of its
bad
own.
roads.
It looking the
Every
mobility of a
day,
medium with the
Alvin
firepower
heard
and
the same
protection of a
problems.
heavy
The
emerged
same
directly
resigned
from the Pershing
acceptance
experience.
that this was just
Clarence
how it
Smoyer
was.
received the Bronze Star
And
on
then,
September
at some
18th,
point in the
2019,
early 1890s,
nearly 75
the
years after
question
Cologne.
formed in his
He was
mind,
95 years old.
why does a
All
horse
5 crew
slip
members of
on
his
ice?
tank were honoured that day at
It
the
seems
National World War
obvious
II
once you
Memorial.
ask it. A
Smoyer
horse
died on
slips
September
because its
30th,
hoof is
2022.
small.
At
A
99.
large animal,
His story was told in
sometimes
Adam
over a
McCoe's
ton,
2019 book
concentrated
Spearhead,
onto
which
4
became a
contact
bestseller.
points,
The T-26
each the size of a
E3
large
arrived too
man's
late to
fist.
change the outcome of World
All
War
that
II.
weight on
Only
that
20
small
saw sustained
surface
combat
on
in Europe.
ice
The Pershing's
creates
development began
enormous
on May
pressure per
25,
square inch.
1942,
The ice
when the
deforms
Ordnance Committee
slightly,
approved
creating
work on a successor to
microlayer
the
of
M4
water
Sherman.
that
The
acts
Sherman
as a
itself had
lubricant.
barely entered
The
production.
hoof slips.
But
What if
engineers
you
at the
spread
Ordnance
the weight?
Department already
What if
understood
instead
its
of 4
limitations.
small
The tank
contact
sat too
points,
high,
you had one
making it easy to
continuous
spot and
surface,
easy to hit.
a
Its
band that
75mm
stayed in
gun
contact with
lacked
the
punch
ground
against
across
heavily
its
armoured
entire
targets.
length.
And the
The
drive
same weight,
shaft running
spread
from the
across
front
20 or
transmission
30
to the
times
rear
the area,
engine created a
would
tall
exert
hull
far
silhouette
less
that
pressure
enemy
per
gunners
square
learned to
inch.
recognize.
Less pressure,
The solution
less
was the
deformation
T20
of the
series,
ice,
a
less
family of
slipping.
experimental
The idea
tanks
of
with low
continuous
approach to reach.
tracks,
Military police
vehicles that
motorcycle
run on an
patrols riding
endless
Norton
looped
and
belt
BSA
rather than
machines at the limit
wheels,
of their
was
official
not
performance would
entirely
find
new.
themselves left behind on
English
the roads of
inventors had
Normandy
been
by what was,
experimenting with the
on paper,
concept since the
an artillery
1820s.
tractor. This was the
Various
Crusader gun
patents for
tractor. It
portable
was the most
railways
overpowered
and
towing
endless
vehicle
chain
Britain ever
tracks
built,
appeared
with the
throughout
driver
the
at the front
19th
in an
century.
enclosed position
None had worked
and the gun
commercially.
detachment of
Some
6 men in
failed
the rear. The
mechanically.
tow hook at the
Some
back could
failed
take the full
economically.
weight of the
Some
17-pounder
were
in its
ahead
limber.
of the
The
available
ammunition stowage
material.
inside
The
held
chains,
40
the
rounds of
ironwork,
17-pounder
the
ammunition ready to
manufacturing
hand. The
tolerances
whole
needed
vehicle
to
weighed
make a
19
reliable
tons and
continuous
sat low to
track
the ground on
simply
its
weren't
wide tracks,
achievable with
with a
earlier
silhouette that could be
technology.
mistaken at a distance
By
for a combat tank. The
1895,
governed
the
top road
technology
speed
had
was
caught up,
27 miles
and
per hour.
Alvin
The engine
Lombard,
had
in his
considerably more to
blacksmith
give than
shop
that.
in
The governor was the only
had
thing
the
standing. It was
skills,
too thirsty
the
for its
knowledge,
100-mile
and the
range.
problem
It was too loud
clearly
for a
in front
vehicle
of
that
him.
needed to
He
hide.
began to
Its
build.
crews had to know how to
The
drive a tank
development
before the
process
Royal
took
Artillery would
several
trust them
years.
with it.
Lombard
Every
was
one of those
systematic and
criticisms was true,
relentless.
and
He
yet from
built
the beaches of
prototypes. He
Normandy,
tested
through the
them.
hedge
He
country south of
rebuilt them.
Caen,
He
along the
understood
single
the
road to
forces
Arnhem,
involved,
across
the
the
torque
frozen
required
Roman
to drive the
Triangle,
tracks,
and onto the
the
east bank of the
structural
Rhine.
loads the frame
It put
would
the
have to
war's
bear,
best
the
anti-tank
heat
gun
management
exactly where it
challenges of a
needed to
working
be,
steam
exactly
boiler
when
in
it needed to
extreme
be there,
cold. In
in
November
ground that would have stopped
1900,
every
he filed his
alternative.
patent
4 regiments,
application.
4
On May
corps,
21st,
the entire 21st Army
1901,
Group from
the
first
patent was
landing to
granted.
final crossing.
United
The
States
governor was an
Patent number
inconvenience. The engine was not.
674,
That is not over-engineering.
737.
That is the British
The
Army
world's
finding... Now
first
before we get
commercially
into the
successful
specifications and
continuous
combat
track
record,
vehicle.
if you are
Imagine a
finding this
railroad
interesting,
locomotive.
consider
One of the
subscribing.
large freight
It helps the
models,
channel grow.
heavy and
Now let us look at what made
built
this
for
tank
power
different.
rather than
The
speed.
Pershing
Now
weighed
take away
46
the
tons in
rails.
combat
Not just
configuration,
move it off
roughly
the
nearly 13 tons heavier than the M4A3 E8 Sherman. It measured 28 feet 5 inches overall with gun forward and stood 9 feet 1 inch tall. That 28% difference mattered against German heavy armor. Against a Tiger 100mm frontal hull, the 76mm was marginal at best. The 90mm could penetrate reliably at 1,500 meters. The Pershing's weakness was its power plant. The Ford GAF V8, the same 1,100 cubic inch aluminum engine used in the Sherman, produced 500 horsepower. 1944, a converted factory floor in Lincoln, England. A tracked vehicle rolls out at 2,600 RPM, but now it propelled a tank 13 tons heavier. Power-to-weight ratio dropped to just under 11 horsepower per ton compared to the Sherman's 15. Top speed was nominally 30 miles per hour, but realistically closer to 22 under sustained operation. Range was only 100 miles from 183 gallons of gasoline. The automatic transmission was troublesome, and the entire drivetrain was stressed near its limits. Out of the assembly shed and into grey morning light, it has thus ridiculous. Within weeks, crews across 4 core anti-tank regiments of the Royal Artillery would be quietly removing a small mechanical component from the engine bay, pressing the accelerator to the floor, and watching their speedometers climb towards speeds that no tracked military vehicle in the British Army was supported precisely when they were needed most. Something else was required, something tracked, something powerful, something armoured enough that crews could survive the journey from the rear area to the firing position without being cut apart by the machine gun fire and shell splinters that swept any road near the front. The Army looked at it Belgium, South Africa, Poland, Denmark, New Zealand, and even the Soviet Union via Lend-Lease. Surplus vehicles found civilian homes in heavy haulage, forestry, construction, and with travelling fairgrounds. Showman families prized the pioneers' pulling power for hauling rides and powering attractions with massive generators fitted in the rear. One enthusiast reported in the 2020s that his local fair still operated 3 pioneers bought at the end of the war, still going strong. Preserved examples appear at vintage vehicle rallies across Britain, and museums holding pioneers include the REME Museum, Bastogne Barracks in Belgium, and the White Military and Heritage Museum. The Pioneer survived where contemporaries vanished because its design requirements, reliable pulling power in terrible conditions, extreme durability with minimal maintenance, simplicity enabling field repair, never fundamentally changed between 1927 and the 1980s. The walking beam suspension provided off-road capability rivaling many modern designs. The Gardner diesel's low operating speed meant components simply did not wear out at normal rates. Its inventory and found its answer sitting in storage depots across southern England. By mid-1943, the Crusader tank was finished as a fighting vehicle. Its guns could not penetrate the latest German armour. Its mechanical reliability in the western desert had been abysmal. The Nuffield Liberty engine, in 1938, nicknamed Fireball, from the 33rd Armoured Regiment. At dusk in Elsdorf, Germany, Fireball halted before a log barricade when 3 Tiger Is from Heavy Tank Battalion 301 entered from the east. A Sherman behind Fireball was destroyed, and the burning wreck silhouetted Fireball's turret against the darkness. Tiger No. 201 fired 3 shots from approximately 100 yards. The first round penetrated through the coaxial machine gun port in the mantlet, a weak point rather than the main armour, killing the gunner and loader. The second hit the muzzle brake and deformed the gun tube. The third, Glanbert's adaptation of a First World War aircraft power plant crammed into a tank hull, had boiled over, leaked oil, and seized in the heat of North Africa with frustrating regularity. The Sherman had replaced it. The Cromwell was coming. Over 5,000 Crusader hulls had been built, and hundreds of them were now surplus. Engineers at the Ministry of Supply looked at what those hulls still had. They had the Liberty engine. They had the Christie suspension. They had the tracks and the drivetrain. And the Liberty engine, for all its troubles in the desert, the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 9, commonly known as the Famo, was an 18-ton half-track purpose built from 1936 with a 270 horsepower Maybach 512 petrol engine. On paper, the Famo was vastly more capable. 2.5 times the power, 28-ton towing capacity, higher road speed at 50 km per hour. But the Famo's petrol engine gave it a range of just 160 miles, less than 40% of the Pioneer's 430-mile range. Its interleaved road wheels were notoriously maintenance-intensive and prone to clogging with mud and ice. At 18 tons unladen, it weighed more than twice the Pioneer. And even the mighty Famo required 2 to 4 vehicles working together to tow a single Tiger, Panther, or King Tiger. The concept of a specialized heavy recovery vehicle essentially did not exist. And yet this truck, born in that primitive era, would still be serving in the 1980s. The story begins with a family of Victorian craftsmen. George Scammell founded the original business as a wheelwright and coach-building firm called G. Scammell and Nephew. Operating from Fashion Street in Spitalfields, East London, George worked alongside his nephew Richard and Richard's sons Alfred and James. By the early 1900s, the firm had diversified into maintaining steam wagons and small trucks. The critical figure in the pioneer's creation was not a scammer at all. Percy Garibaldi. Hugh served as the company's chief designer and technical director. He's often confused with the founding family because of the company name, but he was the engineering mind behind the machines. The family member who brought military thinking to the business was Lieutenant Colonel Alfred George Scammell, George's great-nephew, who was invalided out of the army during World War I and brought his battlefield experience into vehicle design. The turning point came after the war, when Percy Hugh conceived a revolutionary articulated six-wheeler. In 1933, Scammell adopted the Gardner 6LW diesel engine for all subsequent pioneers, built by L. Gardner and Sons of Patricroft, Manchester. The 6LW earned a reputation as one of the most reliable engines ever manufactured. It displaced 8,370 cubic centimetres across 6 cylinders in line, producing 102 brake horsepower at just 1,700 revolutions per minute. Torque peaked at 350 pound-feet at only 1,000 revolutions per minute. Fuel consumption came in at approximately 0.360 pounds per brake horsepower per hour, with a thermal efficiency of 39 to 40%. Exceptional for the era. The first 20 T26 E3s arrived at Antwerp, Belgium, in January 1945. Brigadier General Barnes personally led the deployment effort known as the Zebra Mission. He arrived in Paris on February 9th and secured Eisenhower's agreement to send the tanks into combat immediately, rather than waiting for further testing. After crew training near Aachen completed on February 23rd, the tanks were split between the 3rd Armoured Division and the 9th Armoured Division, 10 tanks to each division. The T26E3 entered combat on February 25th and 26th, 1945. The first Pershing lost was tank number 30. Enemy personnel and automatic weapons. Enemy tanks would be handled by specialised tank destroyer units, fast and lightly armoured vehicles with big guns designed to ambush and withdraw. McNair also believed the Army could not afford another tank type, complicating the 3,000-mile Atlantic supply line. The Sherman was adequate. A 76mm gun would handle anything the Germans could field. A heavy tank meant unnecessary weight and unnecessary logistics. In a letter to Lieutenant General Jacob Devers, the former head of the armoured force and the Pershing's most vocal champion, McNair laid out his position, McNair wrong. After encountering panthers and tigers in the hedgerows, Eisenhower himself expressed frustration. In a conversation with General Omar Bradley, he reportedly fumed that Ordnance had told him the 76mm would handle anything the Germans had. Now he was learning his tankers could not knock out enemy armour from the front. Major General Morris Rose of the 3rd Armoured Division told Eisenhower directly that he had personally observed rounds from the 75 and 76mm guns bouncing off German frontal armour on multiple occasions. The turning point came after the war, when Percy Hugh conceived a revolutionary articulated six-wheeler presented at the 1920 Commercial Motor Show. It generated 50 immediate orders. The vehicle could carry 7.5 tons legally at 12 miles per hour, when heavier trucks were restricted to just 5. This success demanded larger premises. Scammell Lorries Limited was floated on the 1st of July 1922 with £250,000 in capital. The new factory went up at Talpitts Lane, Watford, next to Watford West Railway Station. Every single Pioneer ever made, military or civilian, came from this one site. The Pioneer itself emerged from a specific colonial need. In 1924, British authorities in India and other territories requested a heavy 6x4 off-road vehicle for regions where sealed roads barely existed. Scammell proposed a design in 1926, and the first prototype was ready by June 1927. It was built for oil fields and logging. Environments that, as it turned out, closely mirrored the demands of mechanized warfare, reached approximately 3,414 units, all manufactured exclusively at the Watford Works. The Pioneer's finest hour came in the North African desert. The Battle of El Alamein was the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers' first major test. REME had been formed barely 3 weeks earlier, on the 1st of October, 1942. According to Imperial War Museum records, REME units recovered 500 armoured cars and carriers and 1,244 tanks, of which 1,007 were returned to battle an 81% return rate, the asymmetry was decisive. While approximately 500 Allied tanks were knocked out, roughly 350 were repaired and sent back into action. All 450 Axis tank losses were permanent because the Germans and Italians lost control of the battlefield and could not recover their vehicles. The walking beam suspension proved ideal for desert conditions, maintaining traction on soft sand where conventional trucks bogged down. The Gardner diesel's range of 430 miles was critical across the vast North African distances of its axles. The 86th Anti-Tank Regiment provides the most detailed operational record. Its 128 and 130 batteries operated Crusader-towed 17-pounders from the Normandy beachhead through the entire campaign. In the vicious fighting around Hill 112 south of Caen in July 1944, the regiment moved its guns repeatedly as the front shifted back and forth across the same high ground. The bocage terrain, with its saturated clay soil and shell-churned fields, stopped. McNair was killed on July 25, 1944, during Operation Cobra at St. Lo. An American bomb fell short and struck his position. He was 61 years old, the highest-ranking American killed in the European theatre. His death removed the most powerful institutional obstacle, but the bureaucratic momentum he had built persisted. Production did not begin until November 1944. It was constructed from a tank the Army had written off as a failure, and it served as the backbone of the most lethal anti-tank capability in northwest Europe from the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine. To understand why the Crusader gun tractor existed, you need to understand the problem Britain faced in the spring of 1943. The Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder anti-tank gun had just entered service, and it was extraordinary. It could punch through the frontal armour of a Tiger tank at over 1,000 yards. It was at that moment the best anti-tank gun the Allies possessed. Every infantry corps that landed in France would need batteries of them positioned ahead of the flanks, and towed them out again when the operation's outer limits were reached. The war diary of the 73rd Anti-Tank Regiment notes that Crusader gun tractors were occasionally used as improvised armoured personnel carriers, their steel crew compartments offering protection during vehicle moves through contested ground when nothing else armoured was available. This was not their designed purpose. The crews did not particularly care. In the winter fighting of early 1945, during Operation Blackcock in January, the regiment operated across frozen ground in the Roman Triangle. The temperature dropped far below freezing. Wheeled vehicles struggled with traction on ice. The Crusader's wide tracks distributed its weight and held the road. The 17-pounder batteries reached their firing positions. Operation Plunder followed in March, the Rhine crossing under fire near Wesel. The Crusader gun tractors crossed on temporary bridges and pontoon ferries, towing their guns onto the east bank of the Rhine within hours of the infantry assault, establishing anti-tank screens before German armour could mount a serious counterattack. Now to the Governor. The Liberty engine at 1,900 revolutions per minute ungoverned produced substantially more output than the 1,500 revolutions per minute ceiling the factory setting imposed. Exactly how much more speed this translated to has been the subject of soldier myth and genuine uncertainty in equal measure. Veterans of the 86th Regiment are cited in multiple sources with the claim that an empty, ungoverned Crusader gun tractor could reach 55 miles per hour on a good road. That figure has been repeated widely, accepted uncritically in some accounts, and dismissed by engineers who have calculated that if a 600-horsepower Rolls-Royce Meteor-engined Crusader test vehicle could only achieve 40-plus miles per hour, reaching 55 from 340 horsepower, seems difficult to square with the physics. The more defensible figure is somewhere between 35 and 45 miles per hour, ungoverned on a sealed road. That Tiger II's 6-inch Glacis at 50 degrees produced over 9 inches of effective protection, far exceeding what the 90mm could penetrate with standard ammunition. Only tungsten rounds offered a marginal chance at point-blank range. A Pershing crew facing a King Tiger head-on had to flank or withdraw. There was no third option. One vehicle attempted to address this gap. A single T-26E4, sometimes called the Super Pershing, reached Europe armed with a longer 73 caliber 90mm gun that matched the King Tiger's ballistics. Its 21-foot barrel required external counterweights. After Fireball's loss exposed the mantlet vulnerability, crews bolted armor plate cut from a disc design, but retained the Pershing's layout philosophy. The M60 continued that lineage into the 1980s, from M26 to M46 to M47 to M48 to M60.
suppress
Over
enemy positions for
36,000
hours.
tanks were produced that
But when
served
the
American
barrage
and Allied
ended and
forces
the
for 4
infantry went
decades.
over the
The
top,
Pershing's
the
chassis,
defenders
its
simply
90mm
emerged from their
gun,
dugouts
its
and resumed their
fundamental design
positions.
approach
Nothing
defined American
moved.
armor
The war
until
was
the
locked.
M1
British
Abrams replaced the
military engineers
M60
needed a
with
solution.
an entirely new
Specific
concept. The
requirements.
Pershing also
A
helped end the
vehicle
tank
that could
destroyer
cross
doctrine
no man's
permanently.
land,
This separate
crossing
tank
shell
destroyer
craters,
branch was
crossing
disbanded in
barbed wire,
1946.
absorbing machine
The Army
gun
would not
fire,
again
and
maintain
carry
that tanks
weapons
should
into
avoid
enemy
fighting other
positions.
tanks.
The
The
answer
concept
was
of
the
the Maine
continuous
battle
track.
tank, combining lives with
Lineage is
medium
direct
armor.
and documented.
10 would be
The British
T-26s
military
with
had been
heavy
using
armor
Holt
designed to match
Caterpillar
or exceed the
tractors,
German Tiger.
mechanical
The
descendants of
T-26 carried a
Lombard's
glacis
design
plate 4
to
inches
haul
thick,
supplies and
102
artillery through the mud of
millimeters.
France
That armor
since
thickness would define
1914.
the Pershing.
These
When the electric
tractors
transmission
proved
proved
that
too
tracked
heavy for these
vehicles could
upgunned
move through
variants,
terrain
both
that
were
stopped
converted to
every wheeled
automatic
machine.
transmissions with
The
torsion bar
engineers
suspension.
designing the
The
new armored
T-26
fighting
became the
vehicle took that proof and built on
T-26E1.
it.
The first
On September 15,
T-26E1 arrived at Aberdeen
1916,
Proving
at
Ground
the
on
Battle
March
of the
6,
Somme, the
1944.
world saw
A
its
demonstration
first tank,
later that month for
the British
Secretary of War
Mark
Henry
I,
Stimson,
a rhombus
Chief of
shaped
Staff
iron
George
box,
Marshall, and
moving
senior
on
generals
crawler
produced a
tracks,
clear
running the full
verdict,
length of
leading
its
to its
hull,
partial
carrying
replacement by
either
the
naval
Diamond
guns or
T980.
machine guns,
Total production across
capable
all
of crossing
variants reached
trenches
approximately
3 meters wide. The
3,414
Germans
units,
called it the
all
Teufelskarren,
manufactured
the
exclusively
Devil's
at the
Car.
Watford
The
Works,
chain
just off
is
the upper
clear
turret.
and
The Tiger,
undeniable.
reversing, became
Lombard
entangled in
invents the
debris and was
crawler
abandoned
track.
by its crew.
Holt copies
Fireball
it
was
without
recovered,
payment.
repaired
The
at
British
ordnance
Army
facilities,
buys Holt's
and returned to
tractors.
service 11
Those
days later.
tractors
The
prove
next
the
day,
viability of
Sergeant
tracked
Nicholas
movement.
Mashlonick in tank
That
number
proof
40
inspires the
avenged
tank.
Fireball by
The tank
destroying an
changes
entrenched
the
Tiger
war.
one at
A
900 to
blacksmith
1,000
from
yards
Waterville,
with
Maine,
tungsten
helped create
rounds,
the weapon
then
that
picking
would
off 2
define
Panzer
land
IVs at
warfare for the
1,200
next
yards with
century.
single shots each.
There is also
Mashlonick
a
later
more direct
recalled,
connection
I
that is
waited
less
until
well
all of them
known.
were on the road with their
During the
rear
First
ends
World
exposed,
War,
and
the
then I
French
picked off
military
each one
worked
with one shell
directly with
each,
Lombard's
just like
original
shooting
machines,
ducks.
not
Germans
Holt's
fielded in a
copies,
stand-up
hauling
fight.
timber
How did
for
the new
trenches,
American tank
bridges,
compare
and
to German
artillery
armor?
emplacements
Against the
through
Tiger
terrain
one,
where
the
nothing
Pershing
else
held
could move.
clear
Alvin
advantages.
Lombard
Its
was
sloped
personally
4-inch
involved in
glacis
supporting
produced
this work.
superior effective
The man
protection
whose
compared to the
invention had
Tiger's
been
flat
taken without
100mm
credit
plate.
was now
The
contributing
90mm could
directly to
penetrate
the
the
Allied
Tiger's
war
frontal hull
effort,
at
while a
1,500
copy of
meters.
his design
The
was
Tiger's
being credited to
88mm
someone else entirely. He
KWK-36
kept
could
working.
not penetrate
He
the
kept
Pershing's
building.
sloped
He
glacis
kept
at normal
serving.
combat
The
ranges,
war
though
ended
it could
in
exploit
November
weak points like the
1918,
machine gun port
and the
as demonstrated
technology
at Ellsdorf.
accelerated by
Against
4
the
years of
Panther, the
industrial
matchup was
warfare
closer.
began
The
reshaping
90mm,
civilian
they never
life.
fired a shot in anger
Gasoline
against
engines
Japanese
matured
forces.
rapidly
The
during
Pershing's
the war
true
years.
legacy was not
By
those
the
10
early
weeks of European
1920s,
combat. It
internal
was everything
combustion
that came
engines were
after.
more powerful,
Reclassified from
more
heavy to medium
reliable,
tank in
and
May
cheaper than the steam
1946.
engines of the
It deployed to
Lombard
Korea
era.
in
The
1950.
steam-powered
The
logging hauler began
309
to look
served against
old,
North Korean
then obsolete.
T-3485s.
Holt's
The
successors and their
90mm could punch through a
competitors
T-34
produced
from front to
gasoline
rear
and
with
diesel
tungsten
crawler
ammunition.
tractors,
Performance
lighter,
against enemy
cheaper,
armor was
easier to
excellent, but the
maintain,
underpowered
that
Ford
could do
engine
much of what
overheated
the
badly in
Lombard
Korea's
did.
mountains,
And
and the
then came
automatic
the
transmission
bulldozer,
remained
a
failure
crawler
prone under
tractor fitted
stress.
with a large
M26,
steel blade at the
the
front.
war it was built to
A
fight
direct
ended 10 weeks
mechanical
after it began,
descendant of the
but it
Lombard
proved
and
what American
Caterpillar
tankers had
tradition.
argued since Normandy.
Its
They had
tracks
been
were the
fighting
same
in machines
fundamental
that could not
design,
match German heavy
but what
armor,
the
while a
bulldozer
better
could do
vehicle
that the
existed,
Lombard could not
delayed by
was move
institutional
earth,
resistance
cut roads,
and a doctrine
clear
that
land,
declared tanks should
push
not fight
obstacles
tanks.
aside.
The weapon
A
American crews
bulldozer could
needed
cut
in
a road through a
1944
forest,
finally reached them in
and a road through a
1945.
forest
The
meant
factories were
trucks
ready.
could enter.
The engineers had
And
solved the
trucks,
problem.
cheap,
The only
fast,
thing that held it
flexible,
back was the army
could haul
itself.
timber better
The
and
pattern
cheaper
series
than
that
any
followed would
purpose-built
ensure
iron
American
hauler
armored
on an
forces
iced
never
road.
faced that gap
Here
again.
was the bitter
That
irony
is the
built into Alvin
M26
Lombard's
Pershing.
story.
Fixes were withdrawn
His
during
machine had made
1951,
industrial
replaced by the
logging in the
improved
deep forests
M46
of Maine
pattern. The
economically
M46 was
viable.
essentially a
That
Pershing with a
economic
new
viability
810
had
horsepower
justified
Continental
investment in forest
AV1790
infrastructure.
engine and
That
an Allison
infrastructure
cross-drive
eventually
transmission.
included
Those two
roads,
changes fixed the
and
Pershing's
roads
greatest
eventually made the
weaknesses.
Lombard
Over 1,000
unnecessary.
M26s
The
were
machine that
rebuilt to
opened the
M46
forests
standard standard. The M47 followed in 1951 with a new turret design. The M48 in 1952 became the first major hull redesign, but retained the Pershing's layout philosophy. The M60 continued that lineage into the 1980s. Now, before we get into the combat record, if you are enjoying this deep dive into British engineering, hit subscribe. It takes a second, costs nothing, and helps the channel grow. Right, let us get into the battlefield. Tank. Sooner or later, the issue between ground forces is settled in an armoured battle, tank against tank. McNair was the most influential opponent, but he was part of a larger bureaucratic system that slowed the tank's entry into combat. In September 1943, Ordnance requested 500 each of T-25s and T-26s for summer 1944 delivery. Army Service Forces declined. Army
6
ground forces
out of
objected to the
83, one of
90mm
them,
gun
a
entirely, and the
1910
absence
model,
of sophisticated
lives at the Maine
systems, no
Forest
power
and
steering,
Logging
no
Museum
electronics,
in Bradley,
no
Maine,
turbocharger,
restored to
meant there was
working
nothing
condition
complex
by
to fail in remote
150
postings where spare parts
volunteers
were
and
months
University
away.
of
The
Maine
Scammell
engineering
Pioneer was
students
not cutting
working
edge.
across
It
multiple
was not
decades.
fast, not
Today, it
powerful,
still
not
runs.
sophisticated.
Steam
It was a
rises,
commercial
the
truck from
tracks
the
move,
horse-drawn era,
the ground
powered by an
shakes.
engine that produced
Standing
less
next to a
horsepower than a
running
modern
Lombard,
family
you
car.
understand
Designed by a
immediately why
Victorian
it
wheelwrights
changed the
firm
world.
for hauling logs
The
in the
noise is
colonies, yet it
substantial.
outlasted
The
every
rhythmic
purpose-built
exhaust of the
military
steam
rival.
engine, the
It
clatter
served in
of track
every
links
theatre of the
engaging
largest war in
sprockets,
human
the
history.
hiss of
It
steam,
recovered more than
the
1,000
vibration
tanks
of
at a single
19
battle.
tons of iron
It was
in
coveted
motion.
by the enemy that
You
captured it,
understand why the
and it remained in
steersman,
military
perched
service
above
for
all
nearly
this
6
on his open
decades. The
seat,
field gun.
was
It had a 70
simultaneously
horsepower
freezing
engine.
and
It had
burning.
4 rubber
You
tires. In dry
understand,
conditions
looking
on a
at
good
this
road,
machine,
it
that
managed a
worked.
17-pounder in
genuinely,
mud,
powerfully
on
worked.
slopes,
And
in
it
the torn
changed the
ground of a
world.
contested battlefield.
Alvin
It could not do the
Lombard
job.
died
It
on
sank,
December
it stalled,
27th,
it left anti-tank gun
1937
batteries
in
stranded.
Waterville,
Recovery
Maine.
crews also
He was
systematically
81
recovered
years
enemy
old.
equipment,
He had lived in
pressing
the same
captured
city where
Italian
he
and
built
German
his
tanks into
machines,
British
and he
service,
died there.
or stripping them
He
for
received some
intelligence.
recognition
In Normandy
his
after
lifetime.
D-Day,
The
Pioneer
patent,
served
the
with the
commercial
7th Armoured
success of 3
Division
decades
and
of
Guards
sales,
Armoured
the
Division
satisfaction of
REMU
watching
workshops.
companies operate
Roughly
his
20%
machines
of all spare
effectively.
parts used in
He
the early
received
stages
more
of the Normandy
recognition after
campaign
his
came from
death.
salvage.
In
During the Battle of the
1982,
Bulge, up to
his home
17
was
recovery
added to the
vehicles were
National
simultaneously
Register of
deployed on a
Historic
single
Places.
core axis between
That
Namur
same
and
year,
March.
the
At the
American
Rhine
Society
crossing
of
in March
Mechanical Engineers
1945, Pioneer
designated the
recovery vehicles
Lombard
helped
Steam
retrieve
Log
at least
Hauler
8
a
Sherman
National
DD
Historic
amphibious tanks
Mechanical
that had
Engineering
bogged down
landmark.
emerging from
And
the
in
river.
Bradley,
The Pioneer
Maine,
also
a
served in Italy
restored
with the 6th
Lombard
Armoured
Steam
Division,
Log Hauler
where
occasionally
mountain roads
runs
and
under a
steep
head of
gradients
steam,
tested its
its
high
tracks
torque
clattering
diesel
against
and
the
walking
ground,
beam
its
suspension to the
exhaust
limit.
stack releasing the
In the
same
Far
shower
East,
of sparks
it served
that
until the
once
last days of
rained
the
down
war
on
in
the
the
men
summer of
who kept it moving through
1945.
the dark.
Though detailed
6
accounts from
machines
Burma remain
out of
scarce,
83
at least
built.
one Pioneer
6
saw action in the
survivors
Korean
out of a
War,
fleet that
where it
worked
was
its way
damaged
to
by a mine
obsolescence,
but
and
repaired
then
and
to
returned to
scrap,
service,
and then to
a fitting
near total
testament to its
disappearance.
durability. To
But the
understand
idea
why this
didn't
mattered
disappear.
strategically,
Every tracked
consider
vehicle
the
on
Pioneer's
Earth
most
carries
direct
Alvin
German
Lombard's
equivalent.
patent
The closest
forward.
American
The
equivalent was the
mathematics
Ward
that allow
LaFrance
a heavy machine
M101
to
heavy
move
wrecker,
through terrain
a 6x6
that stops
vehicle
any
producing
wheeled vehicle, the
133 to
spreading of weight across a
145 horsepower,
continuous surface,
with front
the
and rear winches.
self-laying
It
road
was
of the
faster and
crawler
more
track.
powerful with
That
all-wheel drive,
mathematics was
but
first
it
made
achieved only
commercially
2.5
real by a
miles per
blacksmith
gallon on
in Maine
petrol. The
who
Americans
wanted to
built
save some horses. The next time you see a
5,765 of them,
bulldozer reshaping
compensating
a
through
hillside,
sheer industrial
remember
volume for what
Lombard.
they lacked in
The next
efficiency.
time you see a
Regiments
tank,
served with 1
remember
corps. The
Lombard.
73rd served
The
with
next
30
time
corps. The
someone rides
86th,
through winter,
originally the 5th
remember
Battalion,
Lombard.
Devonshire
And
Regiment,
remember the
served with
steersman
12 corps. The
sitting at the front of a
91st, drawn from the
20-ton iron
Argyll and
machine
Sutherland
in a
Highlanders,
Maine winter
served with
in the
8
dark,
corps. These were not
sparks
divisional
raining
units
down
hunting
from
individual
above.
tanks.
1,500
These were
tons
corps-level
of timber
formations,
building speed
held back
behind
to meet
him
major
on a
German
road
armoured
made of ice.
counterattacks, and
A
deployed
hill
in mass
dropping
to
away
destroy
in front
panzer
of him.
formations
No
that threatened to
brakes,
break
and
through
he
the
doesn't
entire
stop,
Allied line.
because the
Each
job
regiment
isn't
divided
finished
its
yet,
batteries
and
between
because this
Crusader-towed
job, this
17-pounders
brutal,
and
beautiful,
Achilles
terrifying,
self-propelled tank
improbable
destroyers.
job
The two
is
approaches
keeping
had
the
different
world
advantages.
moving,
The Achilles
one
could
run
keep
at a
pace
time,
with an armoured advance
one
without
winter at a
unhooking from
time,
anything. The
one
towed
frozen road
17-pounder,
at a time.
dug in with its
Remember,
shield at ground
too,
level
the
behind a
men you
hedgerow or
never
a fold
heard
in the
of.
terrain,
The
was almost
fireman who
invisible and
shoveled
very
coal
nearly
into the
invulnerable to direct
firebox at
fire.
2 in
The
the
Crusader
morning,
gun
his
tractor made the
face
towed
blistered
battery
from the
viable
heat,
in
his
ground,
hands
where
cracked
wheeled
from the
tractors could
cold,
not operate,
working
because it
both
could position a
furnace and
3-ton
frost
gun
at
in
once.
terrain that would
The
swallow a
engineer
truck.
who
The most
listens
telling
to the
verdict
boiler,
came
the
from
way
the
a
enemy.
doctor listens to a
According to
chest,
historical
pressing
records,
his
captured
ear against the
pioneers were
machine's
pressed into
rhythm,
enthusiastic
reading its
service by the
pressure, its
Wehrmacht.
breathing,
The
its
Scammels that
will
were
to
captured
hold
by the
together
Germans and
for
could be
one more
repaired
run down the
were
mountain.
extensively used by
A
their new
camp cook
owners,
who had
who
breakfast
valued the
waiting
model
at
for its
4 in the
robustness and
morning because the
reliability,
machine
and kept
ran
them
when
running
the ice
until the
was
end of the
right.
War.
not when
After
the clock said so.
1945,
The
pioneers
blacksmith,
continued
who sharpened
serving
the
with the
caulked
British Army of the
boots,
Rhine
reset the
until
track
approximately
pins, welded the cracked
1955.
frames by firelight,
REME
who
units
kept
employed
83
them during the
machines
Korean War,
moving through
where at least
decades of
one was
northern
damaged by a
winters,
mine,
using nothing
repaired,
but iron
and returned to
still, and
service.
the
The
refusal
last
to let a
operational
thing
military
die before
pioneer,
its time.
an SV-2S
These men
nicknamed
left
Swampy,
no patents.
served in the jungles
They
of
filed
Belize
no
until the
papers.
mid-1980s.
They appear in
Approximately
no
40 years
of
after
engineering or
manufacture, it was
invention,
eventually
but
shipped
without
home in
them,
pieces and
the Lombard
painstakingly
Log Hauler was
reconstructed
just
by
iron
43
and fire,
District
sitting
Workshop
still in the snow.
REME at
It was
Aldershot.
the
It
men
now
who made
resides
it
at the
move.
REME
And here is
Museum
what
in
we
Lynham,
tend to
Wiltshire.
forget.
There can be
Living
no
in our
basis for the
age of
T-26
warm
tank
cabs and
other
heated
than the
seats
conception
and
of a tank
GPS
versus
and
tank duel,
hydraulic brakes
which is
that
believed
stop
unsound and
100 tons on a
unnecessary.
dime.
There is no
We
indication that
forget
the
how recently all
76mm
of this was
anti-tank gun is
manual.
inadequate
How
against the
recently
German
the
Mark 6
margin
Tiger
between
tank.
success
Divers
and
fired back with a
catastrophe was
prediction
measured
that would
not
prove
in
accurate.
computer
The tank
tolerances,
destroyer
but
concept
in
is
the
not
strength
practical
of
on
a
the
man's
battlefield.
grip on a wooden
Offensively,
tiller.
the weapon to beat
How
a tank is
recently
another.
the
In
only
April
warning system was a
1944, war, they
sound you
requested that the
recognized because you had
T-26E1 be
listened to that
downgraded
engine
from the
every night for
90mm
3
gun to the
winters, and you
76mm,
knew
the
by
same gun they had
instinct and
insisted was
experience and
adequate
nothing
against
else,
German armour.
when something was
Meanwhile,
about
the
to
fighting
go
in
wrong,
Normandy was
we
proving
forget
Devers
how
right and
physical the
McNair
industrial
wrong. After
world
encountering
once
panthers and tigers in the
How
hedgerows,
loud,
Eisenhower
how hot,
himself expressed
how
frustration.
cold, how
11 months
unforgiving.
after Marshall's
The Lombard
authorization,
Log
the
Hauler
production
didn't have
model,
a cab.
designated
Not at first. The
T-26E3,
steersman sat in
incorporated
open air,
23-inch
exposed
tracks,
to every degree
improved
of a
cooling,
Maine
and
January,
fixes to the problems
guiding a
identified
machine
in
that weighed
testing.
more than
Fisher
some
Tank
small
Arsenal in
ships,
Grand Blanc,
down
Michigan,
roads that
began
were
deliveries that
engineered to be
month.
slippery by
Detroit
design.
Tank Arsenal would join
The road
production in
crews
March
flooded the haul roads
1945.
every
A
night,
crew of 5
poured
operated the
water
vehicle.
across the packed
Driver and
snow,
assistant
and let
driver
it
sat in the
freeze
hull.
into a glass
Commander,
smooth
gunner, and
surface
loader
that
worked in the
reduced
turret.
friction,
The armour represented a
increased speed,
generational
and
leap.
left
The upper
absolutely
glacis was
no
4
room
inches
for
of
error.
cast armour
Speed
angled at
was
46
efficiency.
degrees,
Speed
producing
was profit.
approximately
Speed was the
145
only way
millimeters
the
of
timber
effective
reached the
protection
mill
against
before the
incoming
spring
fire.
thaw
The
turned the forest
T-30E16
roads
was a
back into
tungsten
mud,
carbide
and the whole
sub-caliber,
operation
round
shut
at
down until the
3,350
following
feet per
November.
second.
Speed was
Devastating
also the
but
thing that
scarce
killed
due to
men.
tungsten shortages.
Not
At
often,
1,000
but
meters,
enough.
the 90mm
A chain that
M82
parted under
penetrated
load.
128
A sled that
millimeters of armour
jackknifed on a
at
turn.
0 degrees
A steersman
obliquity.
who made one
The
correction too many,
76mm
or one
M62
correction too
penetrated
few,
100
on a
millimeters,
road that offered
produced
nothing between
340
control and
brake horsepower.
catastrophe.
The
The ones
conversion
who
was
survived
systematic
didn't
and
brag
deliberate.
about it.
Foden's
They came
Limited
back
built
the
the
next
first
morning.
prototype.
They climbed
Ruston
back up onto the
Bucyrus built
machine.
5 more.
They
The
went
production
back down the
contract
hill.
went to Ruston
That
and
was the
Hornsby of
job.
Lincoln, and they
Alvin
began deliveries in
Lombard
March
patented his steam
1944.
log hauler
Before the
in
vehicle ever
1901.
entered service,
Within a
engineers
decade,
applied
his
approximately
machines
40
were
individual
working timber
modifications to
operations
address
across
every
Maine,
mechanical failure
New
the Desert
Hampshire,
Campaign had
Vermont,
exposed.
Quebec,
New
New
drum-shaped air
Brunswick.
editor, the
Wherever
Crusader's
the northern forest was
340
thick enough
horsepower
and the
was
winter
not
was
a
cold
luxury.
enough,
In
and the
northwest
timber
Europe,
was valuable
across the
enough to
specific
justify
terrain
the
where the
cost of
17-pounder
iron,
batteries had
steam,
to
and
operate,
coal.
it was the
By
minimum force required.
1917, the
The Achilles
gasoline-powered
self-propelled
version
tank
had
destroyer,
largely
which shared the
replaced the
anti-tank
steam
mission,
model.
carried its
Cheaper
gun
to
integral
run,
to the vehicle
easier to
and
start in the
required
cold,
no towing at all.
less
It was in many
dependent on a
ways the more
constant
elegant
supply of
solution,
water
but it
and
was a
fuel.
dedicated
By the
fighting vehicle and a
1930s,
limited
the
resource. The
purpose-built
Crusader
log
allowed
hauler
conventional
had been
towed
replaced
guns
by
to achieve the
converted
same
tractors
battlefield
and
mobility
purpose-built
as
skidders.
self-propelled
The
weapons in
ice roads
conditions where
gave
that
way to
mobility was
gravel
decisive.
roads.
The two
The
systems
gravel roads
complemented
gave
each
way to
other,
paved
and the
logging
regiments that
roads
operated
that
both
heavy trucks
consistently
could work
employed them in
year-round.
combination
The
rather
window
than
of the
choosing between
Lombard
them.
Log
After the
Hauler's
war ended, the
commercial
Crusader
life
gun
was
tractor was
barely
retired from
30
British
years.
service almost
30
immediately.
years
It had
to
been
change the
purpose-built for
world.
one
Think
campaign
about
and one
what those
gun,
30
and once
years
Germany
produced.
surrendered, both the
The
campaign
tracked
and
vehicle
better
concept,
seals,
proven
improved
in the Maine
gaskets,
timber
reinforced
industry,
pipe runs,
refined by
and a new bevel
Lombard
gear
and his
fan drive
competitors,
transformed the engine's
documented in
reliability.
engineering
Testing
journals
confirmed
and
that these
patent
changes had
filings,
doubled the
was
engine's
studied
service
by
life from
military
1,200 to
engineers on both
2,800
sides of
miles.
the
The vehicle
Atlantic
that the Royal
before the
Artillery
First
received
World
was a
War.
fundamentally
The
more
British
reliable
Landship
machine than the
Committee,
one the Royal Armoured
developing
Corps
what
had
would
cursed
become the
across
tank,
Libya and
drew
Tunisia.
on
The turret ring
exactly
was
this
plated over.
tradition.
An
The
open-topped
same
armoured
mechanical
superstructure of
logic, the same
14mm plate was
solution to the
welded
same
in its
problem.
place, forming a
How
crew
do you move
compartment that
something
seats
very
standing
heavy
between a
across
well-trained
ground
crew and
that will
something
not
far more
support
interesting?
wheels? You
Now,
spread
before we
the
get into
load.
the combat
You lay
record and
your
how
own
these
load.
vehicles performed
You
from
keep
Normandy to the
moving.
Rhine, if you are
Caterpillar,
finding this deep dive into
Komatsu,
British military
John
engineering
Deere,
worth your time,
every
hit
crawler tractor
subscribe. It takes a
manufacturer in the
second, costs
world
nothing,
is
and
building
helps
on
the
a
channel grow.
foundation that has
Now,
Alvin
Northwest Europe,
Lombard's name
1944,
somewhere
the
in its
Crusader gun
genealogy.
tractor was issued to
The
4
Apollo
corps
lunar
anti-tank
roving
regiments of the
vehicle
Royal Artillery,
used a
each
variant
attached
of
to
the
a corps
same
headquarters
tracked
within the
mobility
21st Army
concept,
Group. The
scaled
62nd
down and made
anti-tank
electric,
wheeled vehicles
designed to
entirely.
carry
The
two
Crusaders crossed it
astronauts
without
across a
difficulty.
surface
Gun
that no
positions that would have
wheeled
taken
vehicle
hours
could
to establish
reliably
with the Morris
navigate. From a
C8
frozen
were
logging
occupied
road in
and ready to
Maine
fire
to
in
the
minutes.
surface of the
During
moon.
Operation Market
That
Garden
is
in
what an
September
idea can do
1944,
when it is
the regiment
right
advanced
idea
with
at
30
the right
corps along the
time,
single road
built
toward
by the
Arnhem.
right
The road
hands.
itself was
6
contested,
machines
flanked by
survived.
soft ground that
Go see
swallowed
one if you
everything
can.
wheeled.
Stand
Crusader gun
next to it.
tractors moved
Look at the
17-pounder
scale of it.
batteries up
The
under
massive
fire,
iron and
repositioned them
steel
when
that
German
two men
armour
once
threatened the
drove
road from the
through
still
forests
extraordinary for a 19-ton tracked vehicle. It is still faster than anything else on tracks in the British Army at that time, and it was unambiguously faster than a Norton or BSA motorcycle running on wartime pool petrol with a rider in full kit. Whether any particular military police patrol was actually left behind by a Crusader crew who had quietly visited the engine bay is unverifiable, because no official complaint or disciplinary record appears to have survived. What is verifiable is that governor removal was practiced at unit level across across all theatres,
But the
was
men who
reportedly
actually
carried out
moved the
almost as a
world,
matter of
who
routine
drove
by
the
light aid
machines,
detachments,
fed the boilers,
and was tacitly
held the
tolerated
tiller
by
on the
officers
ice
who
road
knew
at
what
2
their
in the
vehicles were
morning,
actually
when the
capable
hill
of.
fell
The
away
soldiers
and the
called it the
load came
fastest
on,
thing on
and
tracks.
everything
That is almost
depended on
certainly
one
true
pair
within
of
its
hands
context.
making
The army
right
did not
call.
design it
Those
to be
men built
fast.
the
The engine
modern
simply
world
made it
out
that
of
way.
iron and
And the men who
winter
drove
and
it were
will,
not inclined to limit
and they
themselves to
deserve to be
paperwork. On
remembered.
paper,
Let
what
us
made
know
the
in the
Gardner
comments
legendary
from
was
which
its
part of the
engineering
world you are
philosophy. The
watching
engine
this
turned
video.
slowly,
If
meaning
you're
internal
enjoying our
components
videos,
experienced
don't
far
forget
less
to
stress than in
subscribe to the
higher
channel.
revving designs.
Remember them
Gardner
all.